Everyone, welcome to today's live stream. I got a question from one of my Goats 365 members, and she was thinking of adding a large breed to her herd of Nigerian dwarfs, and she was wondering if they would get along or if the big goats would automatically be dominant over the Nigerians. And so I thought this will be easier for me to do a live stream on. And plus, I know a lot of people have this question. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is in terms of basically your does living together in one pen, because this answer is a little different for bucks and does. You might have more trouble with your bucks because they're hormonal, and during breeding season, bucks tend to fight a lot. And even if you just have one breed, like we, for most of our years, most of our 21 years of having goats, we have had only Nigerians, and they certainly fight enough during breeding season. So the boys just get hormonal, and if they're evenly matched, that's not usually a problem. I would be a little more worried if we had a big buck in there. We did have La Manchas for a while, and we only ever had one La Mancha buck, because then we started making mini La Manchas and used our Nigerian bucks. The La Mancha buck we had was not mean towards the others, and so that was not a problem. But when it comes to testosterone, I wouldn't say anything is for sure. So if you wanted to have two separate breeds, and that would include getting enough bucks, then that would probably mean you would need at least two bucks of the larger breed so that you could keep them penned separately, at least during breeding season, or keep a wether to keep with him as a companion during breeding season when they're fighting. We have had one buck wind up needing emergency vet care during breeding season, and that was because he hurt himself on a fence. Basically, we had one buck in one breeding pen with does, and another buck in another breeding pen with a doe, and the two bucks decided to fight. Like, hey guys, you both have your own girlfriends, but testosterone is tricky. So they were butting heads through the fence, and there was a sharp point somewhere, and one of them poked his eye so badly his eyelid was completely turned inside out, and I actually thought he poked his eye out till I separated the two halves and saw, like, oh no, the eyeball is in there. It's just underneath a very, very swollen eyelid. So anyway, bucks are their own story. As for does, having does of different breeds live together. So we did have La Manchas for about 8 years, and the La Mancha does, every goat has its own personality. However, breeds, one of the reasons we got La Manchas is because we knew several people who had Nigerians and they added La Manchas, and they did fine. La Manchas are very mellow. They're very curious. And so in terms of like the breeds, I wouldn't say that it's a bad idea to put La Manchas with Nigerians. One of the La Manchas was very dominant, and she was absolutely the herd queen for as long as she was with us. In fact, she dominated. Like, she had to have pretty much a whole hay feeder to herself. She would butt away anybody else, except we had this one little tiny Nigerian dwarf that I never sold because she was too small. And I was afraid that she would get into the wrong hands and somebody would get a crazy idea to create teacup goats or something. And then she would wind up dying trying to give birth to kids that were too big for her because she was just very small. She never got to be a normal size. And I think it's interesting. I guess maybe as a La Mancha, she just knew that this tiny little doe, this doe was like the size of a 6-month-old. And she was with us for like 12 or 13 years. But I guess that La Mancha doe just knew that little bitty doe was not really a problem. Or maybe it's because that little bitty doe did not have a dominant bone in her body. But it was very interesting that the La Mancha Viola would let Lil eat from her hay feeder, but nobody else. She would butt everybody else away. So they definitely have their own personalities. And the interesting thing about that is that her full sister, Claire, which was short for clarinet, you get that, viola and clarinet. Claire was one of the most mellow goats out there. So it was definitely an individual goat difference. Claire just fit right into the middle of the Nigerian herd. She either had no clue that she was bigger than everybody else, or she didn't care. She was just perfectly happy, being in there with everybody else and, being an equal with the Nigerians. I just think that's really funny, since she was a full sister to this doe who decided she should be the herd queen. And their mom also was very much in the middle too. So I don't know what there was about that. And then with the minis, because we had a lot of mini manchas, they fit in right perfectly with the Nigerians in terms of personality and stuff. One thing is that I always want to mention when people start talking about having more than one breed is that you absolutely need to be doubly, triply sure that there is no way you're going to have any accidental breedings. That is actually why I never got more than one La Mancha buck, because that La Mancha buck could jump a livestock panel. And a livestock panel is, I think, like 48, 50 something inches. They're really tall. Like they come up to here on me. And he jumped two fences. I always keep two fences between my bucks and my does to avoid accidental breedings. And that La Mancha buck was the world's best jumper. I think he was part deer. He jumped that fence, and then he jumped another fence that was also about 4.5 feet high to get in with all the does. And after the second time I found him in there with all my Nigerians, I just said, no, we're not doing this anymore. And I actually wound up castrating him. And when that happened, I also, like every doe that I had not bred, because it was breeding season, of course, that's why he wanted in there, because he could smell the does. And so I wound up getting Ludolice from the vet, and I gave Ludolice to all of the Nigerians that I had not already bred. So that if they were pregnant, I gave it to them a week after he was in there, so that if any of them did get pregnant when he jumped in there, then that would have ended the pregnancy. And honestly, that is probably why he got in there, is because somebody was in heat. And by the time we found him, he'd already done what he wanted to do and was finished with that. And after the second time I did that, I just was not happy. I was like, this is not sustainable. I'm not going to keep doing this with my does. And it actually wound up leading me to an insane amount of angst 5 months down the road, because one of the does that did not get Ludolice, because she had been bred to a Nigerian, so I thought she was already pregnant. 5 months after her breeding date, she did not kid. And so then she was obviously pregnant, quite large. And I was freaking out like, oh my gosh, she did not get pregnant when I bred her. And so then she got pregnant when the La Mancha got in there, because I did not have a second due date written down. And so I was all prepared. I had actually called multiple vets to find out the price of a C-section, as well as, who I would be able to reach. Ended up like, okay, if this happens, and like, what do I do? Like, well, she starts pushing and you see ginormous hooves and she can't get the kid out, then we don't have any choice but to bring her in for C-sections. Just wait and see what happens. And amazingly enough, she gave birth to quadruplet Nigerian kids with normal ears, which means that they were 100% Nigerian. And a couple of them were polled, which then told me like, oh, somebody must have bred her to the polled buck when she came back into heat, and they did not write it down. So that also taught me not to freak out about goats that I think are overdue. It's like, no, they're not overdue. Somebody just failed to write down the correct breeding date. So anyway, there's a lot. It just gets really complicated. Somebody who had a boar herd wanted to get a couple of Nigerian does for me a few years ago. And, I talked to her about it very honestly. And, how confident are you that you're going to be able to make sure that your boar buck can never get to these Nigerian does? Because if he does, like you're looking at a C-section in all likelihood. And the thing, you know, of course, there are people who have gotten lucky, which is really irritating because then they just tell everybody like, oh, it's not a big deal. My goat did it and it was fine. Well, you just got lucky, you know, because I've had purebred Nigerians that had to have a C-section because they couldn't give birth to a 5-pound kid. And my mini Mancha babies, when we bred our Nigerian bucks to the La Mancha does, those kids were usually around 7 pounds or more. And, you know, so that's why if you get into minis, you have to breed the doe. The doe needs to be the big breed and the buck needs to be the Nigerian breed to make sure that they're going to have an easy time giving birth. In fact, a lot of people wind up getting a Nigerian buck to breed to their big does as first fresheners so that they can breed them as yearlings and they don't have to worry about kidding problems because they know the kids are going to be a pound or two smaller than if they bred them to their standard buck that is of the same breed. So breeding a standard doe to a Nigerian is totally fine. That gives you an F1 mini dairy goat, which you could register with one of the mini dairy goat registries and sell those kids. Plus minis are awfully cute too. They're a really nice size. Cindy said, I've had La Manchas and they swing their head at the Nigerians and punching them in the shoulders and the sides. When they weigh more, it's not always a good mix. I have to watch the mini Manchas because they can be bigger as well. Yeah. So individual personality can definitely play a role. So that's something to think about because there's just no guarantees. You know, like I said, like Viola, the worst thing that Viola ever did after she declared that she was the herd queen was to not let anyone else eat from her hay feeder. So that was pretty easy for us to deal with. But they could be a lot meaner and, you know, having a huge weight advantage could really be a problem for them, for the smaller goats. So if you are listening to this later and you've got any questions, feel free to post in the comments section below and we'll get back to you. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.